Thank you, John, for that generous introduction. It's a true privilege to be here at the Royal Society tonight. To be honest, I'm overwhelmed by the turnout. Thank you all for being here. As we gather in this esteemed institution, a place synonymous with groundbreaking discoveries and intellectual giants, it feels almost ironic to be discussing something as seemingly ordinary as the midlife crisis. A topic more familiar to sitcoms than scientific journals, you might think. Yet, as we delve deeper, we'll see the surprising connections between scientific progress and our understanding of the human condition, even in its most relatable quirks. After all, as Isaac Newton famously said, we build too many walls and not enough bridges. Tonight, we'll try to build a bridge between scientific inquiry and the human experience of aging, particularly in midlife. This lecture is dedicated to three remarkable individuals: John Wilkins, John Desmond Bernal, and Peter Medawar. John Wilkins, a polymath and founding member of the Royal Society, embodies the spirit of interdisciplinary exploration that will guide us this evening. John Desmond Bernal, renowned for his work on X-ray crystallography and molecular biology, shared a deep fascination with the interplay between science and society, a theme that resonates deeply with our topic. And then there's Peter Medawar, a Nobel laureate celebrated for his research on immunological tolerance. Less known is his keen interest in aging, which he termed an unsolved biological problem. He even used the term senescence to describe this process, a term popularized by psychologist G. Stanley Hall to define midlife as the period between youthful exuberance and the decline of aging. So, while a talk about midlife crises might seem out of place at the Royal Society, I hope to honor the legacies of Wilkins, Bernal, and Medawar by shedding light on the complex interplay of social, cultural, and yes, even scientific factors that shape our experiences as we navigate the terrain of midlife. Let's rewind the clock to the late 1970s. Picture, if you will, the iconic British sitcom The Fall and Rise of Reginald Perrin. Reggie Perrin, a 46-year-old man, resides in a nondescript house in the suburbs with his wife Elizabeth. Their two children are on the verge of adulthood, transforming their family home into a space that no longer feels quite right. Reggie endures a soul-crushing daily commute to his job as a middle manager at Sunshine Desserts. Overwhelmed by a crushing sense of disillusionment, Reggie's world begins to unravel. He lashes out at work, contemplates infidelity, and becomes increasingly erratic. In a symbolic act of rebellion, Reggie decides to burn all his childhood mementos, as if trying to erase his past, and by extension, himself. Convinced that he can no longer endure his current reality, Reggie becomes fixated on two drastic options: disappear or end it all. In a desperate act of self-preservation, he drives to the coast, sheds his clothing, walks into the sea, and doesn't drown. He returns to the shore, dons a new identity, and attempts to start life anew as Martin Wellborn. While I won't spoil the ending for those unfamiliar with the story, the underlying theme of Reggie's breakdown resonates deeply with the concept of a midlife crisis. This wasn't just a fictional trope, but a cultural phenomenon, particularly in the 1960s and 70s. The term itself was coined a decade earlier by Canadian psychoanalyst Elliot Jacques, a founding member of the Tavistock Institute for Human Relations. Jacques, deeply influenced by his own psychoanalysis with Melanie Klein, described the midlife crisis as a unique form of psychological distress experienced primarily by men between the ages of 35 and 45. He posited that during this deadline decade, individuals confronted their own mortality with alarming clarity, triggering a cascade of anxieties and often reckless behavior. This existential crisis, according to Jacques, stemmed from the realization that life's trajectory, once perceived as a limitless upward climb, had peaked, leaving only the inevitable descent towards death. The once distant horizon was suddenly upon them, and panic ensued. To cope with this jarring realization, men, in particular, engaged in what Jacques called manic defenses, desperate attempts to outrun the ticking clock of time. These defenses manifested as an obsession with youthfulness, a preoccupation with health and appearance, and even reckless sexual escapades, all in a futile attempt to recapture a fading vitality. Jacques' work resonated with the theories of other prominent psychologists of the time. Carl Jung, for instance, famously documented his own psychological crisis at age 37. And Erik Erikson, a developmental psychologist, proposed a model of psychosocial development characterized by 8 distinct stages, each marked by a specific conflict. The stage aligning with the typical midlife period, according to Erikson, revolved around the tension between generativity, the desire to create and contribute, and stagnation, the fear of becoming stuck and irrelevant. This psychoanalytic framework for understanding midlife wasn't confined to theoretical journals. It permeated various fields, shaping the practices of marriage counselors and therapists, particularly those associated with organizations like the National Marriage Guidance Council and the Tavistock Clinic. However, psychological turmoil wasn't the sole explanation offered for the midlife crisis. Some pointed to biological factors, particularly the visible and often distressing signs of aging. Peter Medawar, in his exploration of the biology of aging, highlighted the gradual decline in physical vigor and vitality that accompanies the passage of time. The graying hair, the expanding waistlines, the waning energy levels, all served as tangible reminders of life's ephemeral nature. This biological perspective wasn't entirely separate from the fear of death that Jux described, but it emphasized the tangible physical reality of aging that contributed to the anxieties of middle age. Adding another layer to the biological narrative was the focus on women's experiences of midlife, particularly in relation to menopause. The prevailing and often misguided view at the time was that women's worth was inherently tied to their reproductive capacity, and the cessation of menstruation signaled a dramatic loss of purpose and identity. This period, often accompanied by physical and emotional changes, was frequently pathologized, framing women as victims of their own biology. Even men, grappling with their own midlife crises, sometimes projected their anxieties onto their wives, blaming menopause for their relationship struggles. Returning to Reggie Perrin, we can analyze his breakdown through the lens of individual psychology and biology. He was a man grappling with feelings of inadequacy and a profound sense of loss as he confronted his mortality and the perceived decline of his physical prowess. Yet to fully grasp the complexities of his situation, we need to broaden our perspective, to zoom out and examine the socio-cultural landscape that shaped his experiences and contributed to his crisis. What were the broader forces at play that made the midlife crisis not just a personal struggle, but a widespread phenomenon in the mid-20th century? A crucial piece of the puzzle lies in the concept of the standardized life course that emerged in the early decades of the 20th century. As Bernice Neugarten, a prominent American psychologist, astutely observed, the milestones of life are not merely biological, they are socially prescribed. This social timetable, dictating when individuals were expected to marry, have children, establish careers, and eventually retire, exerted a powerful influence on people's perceptions of themselves and their place in the world. This standardized life course didn't simply appear out of thin air. It was shaped by significant demographic shifts. Life expectancy in the West had dramatically increased since the turn of the century. While those born in the late 19th century could expect to live to around 40 or 50, their counterparts in the 1950s and 60s enjoyed lifespans stretching into their 70s and beyond. This increase in longevity, while a positive development, had profound implications for how people experienced adulthood and aging. It meant more time spent in the workforce, more years of marriage, and a longer period to potentially contemplate feelings of regret or unfulfilled potential. Simultaneously, social norms around marriage and family life underwent a transformation. Marriage, once a considered decision often made later in life, became increasingly common at younger ages. By the 1950s, over half of all women were married by age 24, a significant increase from previous generations. Couples were also having fewer children and spacing them closer together, leading to a longer period of life after child rearing, particularly for women. Men's lives, on the other hand, were often defined by their careers, with many entering the workforce at a young age and remaining in the same job until retirement. This rigid structure contributed to a sense of predictability, but also created a heightened awareness of time passing and a potential for feeling trapped in a rut. This standardization of the life course, with its clearly delineated stages and transitions, had several unintended consequences. It fostered a culture of age anxiety, as individuals became acutely aware of how their own progress measured up against societal expectations. The pressure to conform, to keep up with the Joneses, as the popular phrase went, created a breeding ground for envy, competition, and a relentless pursuit of external markers of success. This emphasis on achieving specific milestones by certain ages led to a sense of inadequacy and disappointment for those who, for whatever reason, deviated from the norm. Perhaps they married later, had children later, or not at all, or struggled to find fulfillment in their chosen careers. This dissonance between societal expectations and individual experiences contributed to a sense of being off track, fueling the fires of midlife discontent. The emergence of the sandwich generation added another layer of complexity to the midlife experience. This term, coined in the 1980s, aptly described the predicament of those caught between caring for both aging parents and their own children. The financial and emotional demands of supporting multiple generations could be overwhelming, leading to burnout and resentment, particularly for those already grappling with their own anxieties about aging and mortality. Financial pressures also loomed large during this period, as economic changes and shifting inheritance patterns created new challenges for those navigating middle age. In the past, inheritance often came earlier in life, providing a financial cushion during child-rearing years. However, by the mid-20th century, inheritance tended to come later, after children had left home and financial needs had shifted. This created a financial squeeze for many middle-aged couples, adding to the stresses and uncertainties of this stage of life. The rise of the empty nest phenomenon further amplified the challenges of midlife, particularly for women. With children leaving home earlier and life expectancies increasing, women found themselves facing decades of life after their primary caregiving responsibilities had ended. This transition, while potentially liberating for some, could also be a time of profound loss and identity crisis, as women grappled with the question of what next. Margaret Mead, a prominent anthropologist, captured the essence of this dilemma in her 1949 book, Male and Female. She argued that, in a world in which people may reorient their whole lives at 40 or 50, marriage for life becomes much more difficult. Mead's observation highlighted the inherent tension between the evolving nature of individual aspirations and the societal expectation of lifelong monogamy. The extended lifespan, coupled with the pressures and possibilities of midlife, prompted many to reassess their relationships, their careers, and indeed, their entire lives. This period of introspection often exposed cracks in seemingly solid marriages, leading to what some experts termed a marriage crisis. The stresses of midlife, combined with a growing sense of disillusionment and a yearning for personal fulfillment, led some to question the very foundations of their partnerships. This perceived threat to marital stability became a source of societal concern, as marriage was widely viewed as the bedrock of a stable and prosperous society. The rising divorce rates during this period were often attributed, at least in part, to the challenges men and women faced as they navigated the turbulent waters of midlife. So, while we can understand Reggie Perrin's breakdown as the product of his individual psychological makeup and biological predispositions, we must also recognize him as a product of his time, a man swept up in the currents of social and cultural change. He was a victim of shifting expectations, economic pressures, and the often unrealistic demands of a society grappling with its own anxieties about aging, mortality, and the pursuit of happiness in a rapidly changing world. But what about the pull, the allure of a different life that led Reggie to abandon his old self and seek a fresh start? To understand this aspect of the midlife crisis, we need to explore the meaning and cultural significance of the phrase, "life begins at 40." This seemingly optimistic phrase, often touted as a beacon of hope for those facing the perceived decline of middle age, has a surprisingly complex and nuanced history. Its origins can be traced back to 1917, not in the self-help aisle of a bookstore, but in the midst of World War I. The phrase was uttered by Mrs. Theodore Parsons, a fitness instructor and advocate for women's physical and mental well-being. In an interview given just days after the United States entered the war, Mrs. Parsons, addressing the importance of women maintaining their strength and vitality during wartime, declared, "It is a paradox of life that we do not begin to live until we begin to die. Death begins at 30, that is, deterioration of the muscle cells sets in. Most old age is premature, and attention to diet and exercise would enable men and women to live a great deal longer than they do today. The best part of a woman's life begins at 40. Her message, aimed at what she called the adipose woman of 40, emphasized the importance of physical fitness as a means of not just prolonging life, but enhancing its quality, particularly as women took on greater responsibilities during the war effort. Interestingly, as the phrase, "life begins at 40, gained traction, its original context and intended audience, middle-aged women urged to embrace fitness and vitality, became somewhat lost in translation. The phrase took on a life of its own, transcending gender and evolving into a more generalized mantra for those seeking hope and renewal in middle age. The notion that life could be revitalized, rather than extinguished, in midlife resonated deeply with a society grappling with economic uncertainty and the looming threat of war. It offered a glimmer of optimism in a world increasingly shrouded in darkness. The phrase gained widespread popularity through various mediums, most notably through Walter Pickens' 1931 self-help book, aptly titled Life Begins at 40. Pitkin, an American journalist, capitalized on the growing fascination with this concept, promising readers a roadmap to a richer, happier, and more fulfilling second act. His advice, while often criticized as simplistic and even banal, offered comfort and reassurance to those feeling adrift in the sea of midlife uncertainties. He encouraged readers to embrace the years ahead, to pursue self-fulfillment through leisure, personal growth, and what he called the art of living. Pitkin's message, much like Mrs. Parsons' wartime pronouncements, carried a societal as well as an individual message. His book, published at the height of the Great Depression, offered a glimmer of hope for a nation grappling with economic despair. He argued that if older individuals embraced leisure and reduced their work hours, it would create job opportunities for younger generations, stimulating economic growth. Similarly, if those in middle age and beyond felt empowered to spend their money on leisure and enjoyment, it would provide a much-needed boost to a struggling economy. Thus, Pitkin's work, while offering individual strategies for navigating midlife, also tapped into a collective desire for renewal and optimism during a time of widespread uncertainty and fear. Pitkin's message of hope resonated with a broader cultural shift taking place in the United States during the 1930s. Despite the economic hardships of the Great Depression and the looming threat of another world war, there was a palpable sense of optimism in the air, a belief that a better future was possible. This sentiment found its most enduring expression in the concept of the American dream. James Truslow Adams, an American historian, first articulated this vision in his 1931 book, The Epic of America. He described the American dream not as a guarantee of material wealth, but as a dream of a social order in which each man and each woman shall be able to attain to the fullest stature of which they are innately capable, and be recognized by others for what they are, regardless of the fortuitous circumstances of birth or position. Adams' vision of a more just and equitable society, where individuals were judged on their merits rather than their social standing, resonated deeply with Pitkin's message of self-fulfillment and second chances. Both men offered a glimmer of hope during a time of great uncertainty, suggesting that life, both individual and collective, didn't have to follow a predictable and often disappointing trajectory. However, the hope and optimism that characterized the 1930s were tragically short-lived. The horrors of World War II shattered the illusion of a utopian future, replacing it with a sense of disillusionment and a more cynical outlook on life. The Cold War that followed further eroded any remaining faith in collective progress, leaving individuals feeling isolated, anxious, and increasingly focused on their own survival and well-being. In this post-war climate, the American dream, once a vision of social equality and opportunity, became increasingly associated with material acquisition and individual success. The pursuit of happiness, once envisioned as a collective endeavor, became privatized, reduced to the accumulation of wealth and possessions. Edmund Bergler, an American psychoanalyst, captured this shift in his 1958 book, The Revolt of the Middle-Aged Man. Bergler, drawing on his clinical experience, argued that the disillusionment of the post-war era had created a generation of men desperately seeking happiness in a hurry. They had bought into the message that life begins at 40, but had stripped it of its original meaning, replacing the pursuit of self-fulfillment and social good with a narcissistic quest for instant gratification. Bergler described the mindset of these men as follows: I want happiness, love, approval, admiration, sex, youth. All this is denied to me in this stale marriage, to an elderly, sickly, complaining, nagging wife. Let's get rid of her, start life all over again with another woman. Sure, I'll provide for my first wife and children. Sure, I'm sorry the first marriage didn't work out, but self-defense comes first. I just have to save myself. Bergler's analysis, while certainly provocative, highlights the ways in which the anxieties of midlife were amplified by the unfulfilled promises of the post-war era. The collapse of the American dream, combined with the pressures of a rapidly changing society, created fertile ground for what he saw as a narcissistic retreat into self-indulgence and instant gratification. So, where does this leave us? What can we learn from Reggie Perrin's midlife meltdown and the cultural anxieties that fueled it? First and foremost, we must recognize that aging is not merely a biological process, but a deeply social and cultural experience. Our perceptions of aging, our expectations of different life stages, and our responses to the challenges of midlife are shaped by the values, beliefs, and historical circumstances that surround us. Secondly, we must challenge the notion of the midlife crisis as an inevitable stage of human development. While the challenges of aging are universal, the experience of a full-blown crisis is not. The way we navigate midlife, the meaning we make of this transition, is influenced by a complex interplay of factors, including our individual personalities, our social networks, our economic circumstances, and the cultural narratives that shape our understanding of aging. Finally, we must resist the temptation to reduce the midlife crisis to a simplistic narrative of individual failure or a yearning for a lost youth. It is, in many ways, a reflection of the societies in which we live, societies grappling with rapid change, economic uncertainty, and a growing disconnect between individual aspirations and the realities of a complex and often unforgiving world. As we move forward, it is imperative that we create spaces for honest and nuanced conversations about aging, challenging ageist stereotypes, and embracing the diversity of human experience. We must recognize that midlife, while undoubtedly a time of transition and potential upheaval, is also an opportunity for growth, reflection, and a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world around us. The midlife crisis, then, is not a foregone conclusion, but a call to action. It is an invitation to examine our lives, to reassess our priorities, and to create a future that reflects our deepest values and aspirations. It is a reminder that life is not a linear progression, but a journey filled with twists, turns, and unexpected detours. And while we may not be able to control the passage of time, we can choose how we navigate the terrain of our lives, embracing the challenges and possibilities that each stage has to offer.